We're actually in Jonas Clark's house.
The Clark House was in many ways one of the birthplaces of our entire revolution.
The sermons that he wrote had such an impact on our nation.
To me, it kind of really helped visualize what actually happened.
We still had one unanswered question. Who fired the first shot?
You guys are not the first ones to ask who shot first. Everybody else was asking that as well. How about we go to some actual evidence?
All right,
so I called the vault. And the vault sent a reprint of Reverend Jonas Clark's sermon on the anniversary, 1 year later from the battle, where he laid out the evidence that will answer this question for us. Here's Reverend Clark's answer as to the question, who fired first? Though General Gage has been pleased to tell the world that the troops were fired upon by the rebels, yet nothing can be more certain than the contrary, and nothing more false, weak, or wicked than such a representation.
He had no doubt whatsoever that it was the British, and he laid out the reasons why, and it was very convincing.
He's saying there's a whole crowd of witnesses. You can't question that many people. And then he goes on to say that people that thought that someone fired from the meeting house or the tavern or from houses, he gives a detailed defense of the fact that those guys didn't even have their guns loaded. So here's your eyewitness account. Have we answered it for the rest of the world? I don't know, but in my mind, it's pretty clear that the British fired first.
You know, hearing the sermon and hearing Pastor Clark's points, it made such sense that these 77 men did not want to start a war with an entire nation. They knew from both a biblical standpoint and from a social standpoint that they could not fire that first shot.
These men on the Lexington Green would have been like the doctors and lawyers and engineers of the day. They thought through this. These were thinking men that made a purposeful decision to stand in the face of tyranny. They didn't want to die on that green. They were fathers, they were sons, they were husbands, and even though they came from maybe different walks of life, most of them sat under the preaching of Jonas Clark.
It really put it into perspective when we got to stand in the home of Pastor Clark and read his own words.
If there was anybody that was going to know who fired first, it's going to be this man, the one who trained these troops.
For 20 years, he'd been preaching here in Lexington. In fact, historians have said it was the words in his pulpit that primed the guns that later were that first shot. So maybe the first shot was not from a gun out there on the Lexington Green. It was from the pen at this table writing those sermons that he would deliver to those parishioners that would then line up on the Lexington Green. Maybe the best way to honor the legacy of men like Jonas Clark and Captain Parker and the others that lined up on that Lexington Green is to actually live out the freedoms that they were willing to die for, to still speak the truth with boldness, telling this story in a way that others will be inspired by what he and the other patriots did that day. What an amazing chapter from the annals of American freedom. I'm still amazed that we got to be there for the reenactment of that shot heard around the world. Friends, today in America, morning in America today is no different than April 19, 1775. Just like those Lexington Minutemen, that ragtag bunch that had to line up on that Lexington Green in defense of freedom, we have a responsibility to do the same. Can you imagine having been there when that British Army marched forward? 800 of the King's finest. That's 6 companies of British infantry. That's 10 times the men that the Americans had. And Pitcairn looks right at you and says, "Disperse ye rebels, disperse ye villains, lay down your arms." Would you be like Captain Parker, walking up and down that line of 77? And could you say what he said? Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here. And it's time for us to say today, if freedom's going to survive another generation, if our children and grandchildren are going to enjoy the same freedoms that we've enjoyed, it's got to begin right here. It's got to begin in your homes. It's got to begin on your knees, thanking God for the freedom that we have, but then acting on that freedom. Once again in our pulpits and our pews, just like Pastor Jonas Clark. I guess what I'm saying, friends, is that wherever your Lexington may be, wherever God's called you to stand, then stand. It may be the pulpit, it may be the ballot box, it may be you running for office. If they mean to have war, let it begin.
We actually had a founder's Bible.
But here's one of my favorite quotes from President Reagan that I think fits the moment today. He famously said, "The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave." Now that quote is great, but when you put it in context, it's even greater. This quote was the day that the shuttle Challenger blew up with all of us watching it on television. In fact, I remember this moment. I was a freshman in high school. We were at school and everybody was watching the launch. And when this happened, it shocked the nation. And in many ways, it scared the nation. It caused us to question, should we be taking chances like this? So let me put Reagan's quote in context. Here's what he said in the middle of his speech as he was putting this moment, answering to the American people, should we be doing this kind of thing? And he said this. He said, quote, I want to say something to the school children of America who are watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. So Reagan was talking to me.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow.
Friends, that's the kind of attitude we need in America. I believe there's still pioneers in America that fearlessly pursue happiness, like the Declaration says. Men like Elon Musk, who's taken us to space, but also people right here on Earth in the middle of the Chinese COVID lockdowns. There's courageous business owners like that beautician in Dallas, Texas, Shelley Luther, or the barber in Michigan, Carl Mankey, the gym owners, Ian Smith and Frank Trombetti in New Jersey. They all refused the nanny state that was being forced upon us by politicians. Those, all three of them and others, they have been fined, arrested, taken to jail for simply opening their businesses, for simply believing in individuals to have the freedom and the good sense to make their own health decisions, rather than being controlled by the governors in their states that are acting like dictators. Abbott in Texas and Whitmer in Michigan and Murphy in New Jersey, famously, who said when he was asked how this squares with the Bill of Rights, he said, I wasn't thinking of the Bill of Rights, that was above his pay grade, when in fact the Bill of Rights should be on the mind of every elected official from Water District up to President of the United States.
Good evening, good evening. We are live worldwide right now. Everybody is watching you. Have you liked the class? It's been amazing, hasn't it? Well, I'm Paul Pickering with All Pros. We are just delighted to be partnering with the Patriot Academy and Rick Green to put this on, and also with our Adam Bell over here, who is the Constitution Coach's Executive Director with Rick Green and Patriot Academy, and of course, Believers Fellowship. Let's give Believers Fellowship a hand. And Pastor John will be taking over here in just a second. I wanted to tell you, though, that we have some gifts for everybody here this evening. At this table, we have a selection of different books. One is Socialism Under the Microscope, and we have the Phantom Virus, and just a number of things here. If you want to come get one of each, you can. Just don't grab a handful, but just get whatever you want. It's absolutely free. We want you to have it to take home, enjoy, and even give it away if you need to and read. We're just, again, we're thankful that you're here. We're thankful for those that are watching by Zoom this evening, and we'd like to just open it with a word of prayer. Father God, we just give you praise and honor and glory. We thank you that we do live in a country where we can pray and stand up in freedom today. And I pray, dear God, that it will stay that way. Father, I pray that as we learn the truths of the Constitution and that how the Bible, your word, was so instrumental in bringing that a document around to being our document for this republic. Father, I pray this evening as we learn it that we'll take it to heart and we'll share it. I pray that our pastors across the country will get involved, dear God, and that our churches will be strong in you and in your power. Father, I pray, dear God, for everyone here that you'll bless them right now, and everybody watching by Zoom, we pray a blessing upon them. We give you praise because you are Almighty God, and I pray that you give us strength, Lord Jesus, as we face the coming days. May we be bold, and may we be courageous, and may we share the good news of Jesus, because we have victory in Jesus, and we will never fail, because through you we can do all things. Jesus, we pray it in your precious name. Amen. Again, I am so glad to be here. I want to introduce you to my good friend, the pastor of this church, Believers Fellowship. He is truly an awesome brother, a man of God, a fantastic pastor, a man with a passion. He is a patriot. He is a man that I'm expecting to do something that we challenge pastors to do all over the country. I'm expecting him to run for office and get involved as a community leader in this country, in this state. And I just want to welcome a good brother, John Free. Thank you.
Free 2028. Yeah. Well, I tell you what, after the beating that they gave Donald Trump, I don't know if anybody in their right mind would ever run for president, but I believe God's raising up generations of people. I was praying the other day, and this just began to come out of me that there's a young man on his face even now before the Lord, saying, "Is it me, and when, and how?" So God's got plans. God's got plans, and so stay in the game, stay in the fight. We fight a good fight of faith. I want to remind you, it's a good fight. It's a good fight of faith. Hallelujah. So some of y'all, Les, you're just too old to run for office now. Don't worry about that. If for those of y'all that are part of the church here, you know that I love picking on Les and June. And I picked on June real big on Sunday, so now it's Les's turn. But God's raising up people, and so you just keep praying, you keep believing, and keep fighting the good fight of faith. Keep doing what's right. This is really more of what we do on the ground, more so than what happens in the air. I don't mean spiritually in the air. I'm just giving a difference between the grassroots, the groundswell of people versus the few that are actually in Washington. That's a few. We are many. We are many. So we've got to come awake. Okay, I'm not up here to preach. I'm up here just to simply tell you what to expect tonight. Tonight's video is a little shorter than last week's. We're about 62 minutes of a video. It actually is hot off the press. We received it about an hour ago. So remember, this class is we're the test smarties. We're the test smarties. And so anyway, some things were changed and adjusted. And so we appreciate your feedback from last week. We understand last week was a very long session. If the video glitches somewhere along the way, we might just pause and take a 5-minute break and get things corrected, and you can get up and move around. Feel free to move about the cabin. There's no seatbelt sign on. But remember, everything we do is being seen and watched, and you don't want to disrupt those that are watching near you or in the room or even online. So be courteous about it. But there are restrooms down the hall, coffee, that type of thing. So anyway, we're excited about tonight. After the video tonight, we expect to have former congressman. He has just recently become a regular citizen again. So former Congressman Ross Spano will be joining us live on the Zoom for some questions and things like that. I'm sure you're aware, at least doing the best you can to keep up with everything that's going on nationally. It's happening all so fast, all over the place. It's hard to keep up, but it'll be a good opportunity to ask some questions. If you have any questions concerning the process of impeachment or any of that kind of stuff. I know right now it's kind of like inspecting the bottom of the garbage can, because it's really kind of all garbage anyway. But anyway, but it is where we are. And one last thing before I sit down, I want to remind you. Somebody said to me the other day they didn't like my bumper sticker because it says Jesus is my Savior, Donald Trump is my president. And they didn't like that as a minister, that I shouldn't have anything like that. I said, I don't understand the problem. It's two very true statements. Right. And they said, well, yeah, but the church is too involved with politics. And I said, well, I'd beg to differ with you. The church is not involved enough in politics. So we sat down and went to sleep for several years, and we're just now waking up. So the world is shocked that the church has gotten involved, but it should become a norm. Yes. Where the church is involved in every area of life, especially or including politics. Anyway, so they said, well, what are you going to do when Biden takes the seat? I said, well, Maybe they'll have a bumper sticker that says, Jesus is my savior, Biden is my president. I don't know. I don't know that side produces that kind of stuff. Anyway, but nonetheless, those two would be very true statements. Here's what I want to tell you. I've been encouraging our church. We have found it easy and exciting to pray for President Donald J. Trump and Mike Pence and the cabinet and things because they championed many of the things that we agree with. How much more should we pray for a president and vice president and the cabinet and such that are opposed to many of the things that we want to see happen? How much more should we pray? So if tomorrow at noon things take a change and a transition, I hope that one of the first things you do is begin to pray for our new president. Listen, if God can use a donkey, he can use you. And he can use Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and even Nancy Pelosi, if you can imagine that. All right. We ready, Adam?
Sure thing. Add a quick greeting here. What Pastor John said is absolutely correct. We did just get the videos for this evening, earlier this evening. So we've been pulling things together and excited to share it with you. You're going to see a lot of content, I think, tonight that if you've been through any of the Constitutional Live materials that Rick Green and David Barton have done, you're going to recognize some of the things there, whereas the first two class videos was all new content. So we're going to start seeing some more of that content, but also I have good news. We're having so much fun. And there's so much content that they've decided to go ahead and extend this from a 7-week class to an 8-week class, because there's just too much to fit into 7 weeks. So just wanted to give that a little advance warning. If you see, I thought this was a 7-week course. Well, it's now an 8-week course, and we're going to pretend it was always an 8-week course. But seriously, I'm excited to watch tonight's video along with you guys, and we'll have I think a great time of discussion afterwards. Hopefully everything works correctly. We're running on backup computers to backup computers, and we'll just trust that God is in it, and he's going to take care of us every step of the way. So with that, we'll go ahead and start week 3 of Biblical Citizenship.
Welcome back for week 3 of Biblical Citizenship in Modern America. So far, we have learned about the foundation laid by the Pilgrims. We explored the biblical purpose of government and how it should properly interact with the church and our families. We talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly of America's history and how this is a nation worth saving and a value system worth preserving for future generations. This week, we will visit the place where American independence was officially declared. We're going to be studying the founding documents of America. I'm actually in the room right now where the Constitution was framed, where the Declaration of Independence was passed and signed by our founding fathers. We're in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the cradle of liberty. This is where liberty began for America. And today in our nation, we have a responsibility as free citizens to preserve that freedom for future generations. You know, the founding fathers quoted a lot of different folks in history, Montesquieu and Locke and Blackstone. But according to studies that have been done, where we broke down all of their different writings and their quotes, they quoted the Bible more than anything else. 34% of the time, they were quoting from the Bible. They knew that the Bible gave us the foundations for a free society. Today, we have to ask ourselves, if I'm going to follow the Bible and I'm going to follow being a good citizen, how do those two mix? What do I do to live out my freedom according to what the Bible says I should do and also according to what my Constitution as an American citizen says? That's what we're going to study in Biblical Citizenship in Modern America. So learn these truths, spread these truths, speak this truth, and let's save our constitutional republic in America.
I think biblical citizenship as a Christian would be stewardship. That God has given us this republic to be stewards over.
And you begin to love what God loves and hate what he hates in the scriptures because your heart is lining up with the heart of God because of the gospel.
If you're a Christian, a person of faith, you must care about what's happening in our culture. You must get involved in voting.
Biblical principles are what produce freedom of society, but you won't have biblical principles in society in which you don't have citizens with a biblical worldview.
The further we move away from biblical principles, the further we move away from liberty and freedom.
As people are experiencing tyranny, they're asking why, what has happened, and there's just this feeling of being lost right now and not knowing where to turn. And you just gave us the foundation. This is truth. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution Coach, here with Mark Meckler from Convention Estates. Mark, we're in the room, man.
I'm so blown away. I got to tell you guys, I've watched Rick's classes for years, seen the kids in here, seen the family, seen you in here, and I got to admit, I've always thought, wow, that would be so cool if I got a chance to do that someday. Thank you, brother.
Here we are. Man, it really is my favorite place in all of history. So much happened right here in this room. And so many people are watching these classes now and actually diving into the Constitution, but some people are hesitant. They're like, why should I take the time to study the Constitution? I vote or I do whatever, but I don't have time to study the Constitution. Why should people take time to join us in this room where we're going to walk through the entire Constitution?
This is the place where it happened, right? So the Constitution's debated here, discussed here, there's arguments, it's heated, people have personal interests, you got one colony against each other, right? There's a lot of
drama.
Stuff takes a lot of drama, right?
Yeah.
This is history in the making. Here's why you need to study it, because if you don't study it, if you don't know it, if you don't have it in here and in here, then you can't defend it. And it is definitely under assault in America today like never before. A lot of people think it doesn't matter. It was drafted by a bunch of old white men. It's white privilege or whatever you want to say about it. It is the most important foundational human drafted document in world history, in my opinion.
I love that. I love that. There's such a great groundswell happening all across the country. We want to thank you for joining us in this. I hope you enjoy the next few weeks together. We're going to take you not only into this room to study where the Constitution and the Declaration were done, we're going to take you into the largest private collection of Founding Fathers documents and pull out a lot of those original documents and talk about them in that way. But we're really challenging you every week as you study these things. Start thinking about people you can share it with, become one of our Constitution coaches, and start hosting classes. This is going to happen if you make it happen. This system that they designed works if we work it. So we're challenging you to get involved. Let's all do our part in saving America's constitutional republic. Welcome to Constitution Alive, the Citizen's Guide to America's Founding Documents. We are here in one of the most amazing libraries on the planet with one of the foremost experts on the Founding Fathers and our founding documents, David Barton. David, thank you so much for having us here.
Hey, good to be here, Rick. Thanks for having me, bro.
So why do you dive into so much history? Why spend so much time in the past?
The reason we do that is because we have been the most successful nation in the history of the world to this point. And there's a reason for that. And our objective with what we want to do, our objective is really well stated by John Jay. Now, John Jay became the original Chief Justice, U.S. Supreme Court, but at the time they wrote the Constitution, he and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton did the Federalist Papers, and that was to explain to America what the Constitution is all about. So he's really one of the three guys most responsible for the adoption of the Constitution through those Federalist Papers. He had a great statement on why we study this type of stuff, and this is the statement he made. He said, every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. Now, it's interesting. He relates being free to knowing the Constitution. You ought to know the Constitution and teach the next generation if you intend to be free. He says, by knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they're violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. Now, that's really the objective of what we're doing in all these next lessons that come along. And there's 6 verbs that he has in there that will be really the guideline for what every citizen needs to shoot for. So the 6 verbs.
So this will really drive everything we do for the rest of this course then. This is our outline.
That's the outline. He says, first you want to read the Constitution of your country. You want to read and study it. And it's one thing to read it, it's another thing to study it. Yeah. So read is like a quick perusal, but study is get to know it. And then he says, and then you want to be able to teach it. You want to be able to take the next generation and say, hey guys, here's what you need to know. Here's the document you need to know. Here's the principles. This is what will keep you free. And this is the formula that's produced American success. Then he says, when you do that, then you'll know your rights. And when you know your rights, you'll perceive when they're being violated, and then you'll be prepared to defend and to assert them. And there's a big difference between defend and assert. Defend is on defense. I'll defend my rights. Assert them is I'm going on offense to make sure I defend your rights.
Which we need to do more of.
And that's what we need.
If that's what's going to keep us free, This part is where we're really losing out, teaching the rising generation to be free. If we don't have a good education system, if we're not teaching what's in this room, we're losing the formula.
Well, you hit the education system, let's just be real blunt. We spend up to $120,000 over the educational course of a kid to go to school for 12 years. We're not getting our money's worth.
Yeah, that's in some of our less expensive districts.
Well, that's right. That's the average nationally. So it's going to be up or down in some. Washington, D.C. is way more than that.
Yeah.
So it depends on the district you're in. But what we know is that every state constitution says that the purpose of public education is to prepare active and informed citizens.
So we started those education systems to do exactly what John Jay is saying here. Yeah.
But what we know right now is if you look at recent elections, those who have gone through our public education system, you're looking right now at 70% that do not know the Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
So we're definitely failing on teaching the rising generation.
You're looking at 65% that cannot even tell you what the role of the judiciary is. That's one of the three branches. As a matter of fact, speaking of one of the three branches, 62% of those who have gone through public education cannot even name the three branches of government.
More than half. And they can't. So you definitely don't know what those branches are supposed to do if you don't even know what they are. Yeah.
48% of elected officials cannot name the three branches of government.
That's half of our actual public servants in office.
If you don't know the three branches, you don't know checks and balances, you don't know functions, you don't know what the Constitution, and that's why you read and study the Constitution, you teach it the rising generation.
Well, maybe they devalue what is in here because they think, look, this is old stuff. I mean, I hear that all the time. It's 200 years old, doesn't apply today. Why should I pay attention to all this stuff that happened 200 years ago?
And let me just one more time hit this because this is our objective, and we're going to look at old stuff. So, number one, read the Constitution. 2, study the Constitution. 3, teach the Constitution, especially the rising generation, but maybe to the burger flippers beside you, maybe the mechanics in the shop where you work.
Not only the next generation, your generation.
Because we're at a point now where public education is not taught us. So we got to just teach the Constitution. But once we do that, we want to know our constitutional rights, we want to defend our constitutional rights, and assert our constitutional rights. Now, that's what we're after. But you've raised the issue up, it's a really old document, and we hear that. Because, the Founding Fathers, when they did this Constitution, they didn't have internet. I mean, fastest transportation,
no airplanes,
horses, So what can we... I've been involved in a number of court cases, state and federal courts, on issues of history, original intent. And one of those issues is the issue of the Ten Commandments. Because for generations in America, you're more likely to find a copy of the Ten Commandments hanging in a civic building than in a religious building. Right. And that's just the way it was. I mean, the Ten Commandments are considered the foundation of law. And so in so many of these places where the Ten Commandments has been hanging, there's now lawsuits saying, oh, you can't do that. That's religious. You have to take that down. So in going through and telling the judge, no, here's the first law book in America. It goes back to the Code of 1650, and it quotes the Ten Commandments all the way through.
Yeah.
Now, you take the Ten Commandments and look at the Ten Commandments. I think that thing about honoring father and mother still works. I think thou shalt not kill still works.
There's not one of those that doesn't
every
work
one of
today.
those still works today. And the reason is they're not drawn on specifics, they're drawn on principles. They take timeless principles because the nature of man doesn't change. We still kill people, we still steal, we still perjure, we still disrespect parents. That's why it works. That's the way the Constitution is. The Founding Fathers didn't give us all these specifics. They gave us these principles of jurisdiction, principles of overview, and that's why it still works more than 2 centuries later. That's why it'll still work 2 centuries from now if we know it and save it and preserve it.
So if they were thinking that way, though, I mean, if they were thinking, okay, we're going to put something in place here that needs to be timeless, that's going to still work 100, 200, 500 years from now, how did they get to that point? I mean, who were these guys to have that kind of...
Let's just take the guys who signed the Declaration. Now, you're going to be doing this class in Independence Hall. Independence Hall is where they signed the Declaration and the Constitution. When I throw this up at a major law school, really sharp kids, and I'll say, who do you recognize? Everybody can find Jefferson, everybody can find Franklin, and that's where it stops. I go, wait a minute, 56 guys, give me some more. They don't know them. Number one, we've been taught to recognize our 2 least religious Founding Fathers. So we don't know anything about the other.
Those are the only 2 they really talk about.
That's the only 2 they talk about in schools. And we say, well, how about, let me just take you across the front row. How about Benjamin Harrison here, a great general in the Revolution? Or let's go here to Richard Henry Lee, the guy who actually made the proposal that we separate from Great Britain. He goes on to be one of the framers of the Bill of Rights. You've got the wealthiest man in America right there, Charles Carroll. You've also got one of the poorest guys in America right there with Sam Adams.
Next to him.
Sam Adams is so poor that when they elected him to Congress, he didn't even have a suit of clothes. His neighbors took up a collection for him to get a suit of clothes. He had to go borrow a horse to ride to Congress. You have John Hancock, who's one of the most famous businessmen in America. So you got business money.
Really a mix of
it's everything.
Everything in every career, every
You got
profession.
rich, you got poor. As a matter of fact, 29 of these guys out of the 56 had a college degree. So nearly half of them didn't have a college degree. And
that was my next question, was education, because
education.
They didn't all have the best education.
1/4 of these guys were home educated. Several guys. This guy right here, Roger Sherman, the only guy to sign all 4 founding documents, completely self-taught. He never had any formal education. Wow. But they understood the principles, and they got those principles, and they wrote a document that didn't reflect what was going on 200 years ago. It reflected human nature. And one thing about these guys is they were patriots. Yeah. They loved their country, no question about it. And
what does that really mean? I mean, when you say they're patriots, that's a negative to some today. It's a big positive to others.
It's
what
right.
does it mean?
It's Benjamin Rush, I think, is the best guy to explain it, because Benjamin Rush, John Adams said he's one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. John Adams said there's George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. We will never stop.
And they're again a name that most people are not going to know, Benjamin Rush.
And they should, because he is the top doctor in American history. 3,000 students got their medical diploma signed by him. He's also the father of public schools under the Constitution. He also started 5 universities, 3 go today. He signed the Declaration. He ratified the Constitution. He served in 3 different presidential administrations. He's the director of the U.S. Mint. He's a huge civil rights leader.
Do that much?
One guy.
I know he's one of your favorite too. You have a book on Benjamin Rush and his life.
We have a lot of books by Benjamin Rush. This is one of the original books that we'll talk about in a minute. But what he does is he says, let me tell you what patriotism is. And so this is what he's teaching the rising generation, because the founding fathers understood we got the principles, but if our next generation doesn't understand this, it's not going to work. Yeah. So that's why we put so much time into education.
You got to instill it in each generation.
So here's his definition of patriotism. He says patriotism is as much a virtue as is justice. Now, who would be opposed to justice?
Right.
You know, nobody. He said that's just as much a virtue as justice, and it's just as necessary for the support of societies as natural affection is for the support of families. Imagine trying to keep your family together if you didn't have love in the family. He says, well, imagine trying to keep your country together if you don't have love for your country. You got to have love for your family. You go to the deck for each other in the family. Hey, you got to be willing to do that. And he says, actually, if you're not patriotic, you're selfish. And this is the way he explains it. He says, the amor patria, which is the love of country, the love of your country is both a moral and a religious duty. It comprehends not only the love of our neighbors, but of millions of our fellow creatures, not only of the present, but of future generations. In other words, if you love your country, you're saying, I want what's best for all my neighbors, and I'm going to work my tail off to have a good country because I want my neighbors to be prosperous and safe. I don't want thugs and criminals overrunning them. I want to make sure we got good government. I want to make sure they can keep the money they earn. I want to make sure they got a good education for their kids. And if I love my country, I'm going to fight for those things.
So you're not just thinking of yourself.
Not
just thinking about the other
people.
If
it's just me, I'll just go off the grid somewhere. I'll get out and just live my life the way I want to. I'll go right off the grid. No, if I love others, I've got to fight for my country. I've got to be willing to stand and say, and that's what he says, not just for the present, but for future generations. I want to keep these principles alive so that if the Lord tarries for 200 years from now, this country is still working, still the most prosperous, the most stable, the most free in the history of the world. But that's what patriotism is. And that's why he says it's both a social and a religious duty.
Man, there's so much of that wisdom in this room and in these books. We got to come back to it. Now, our next part of this chapter, I have to thank you for, because we were actually sitting in a restaurant. I don't know if you remember this. We were in Nashville, Tennessee. We'd gone out there for you to speak to some legislators. And you and Cheryl and I were sitting in this restaurant. It's that one where they have live music. Do you remember that?
Yep, I do remember that.
And I was telling you, hey, we've been teaching this Constitution class around. We're going to record it again. And you said, why don't you do it at Independence Hall where the Constitution is framed? I was like, oh, that's a dream. There's no way that would happen. You said, no, I've done it. So you talked me into calling them. I called them. It worked out. And we're going to now be able to go to the very place where all of this happened,
really
the actual room, Independence Hall, and give folks a chance to learn and study the Constitution in the room where it happened. So let's go to Philadelphia for Constitution Alive.
No, the Constitution is so unique. It is the only Constitution that actually limits government. You know, we don't have to empower government. Government on its own will seek power. It will take power. It will grow, as we're seeing happening in the United States. But our Constitution limits the power of government. Part of the problem with people not understanding our founding documents is then they want too much from their government. They want the government to provide things that government is not supposed to be able to provide. And I think that's what we're seeing in America today, is people are wanting the government to provide everything in their lives, and the government is there to actually protect your rights, not to provide you with things, because it allows you to self-actuate, to choose your own path in life. I use the Wright brothers as a great example. 2 bicycle mechanics. If you think about it, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio achieved what for centuries scientists and engineers could not achieve. It's because of the freedom that they have. To be able to, as some people say, go outside the box, but I think the Wright brothers didn't have a box whatsoever, and that's the freedom that you get in this nation.
We have to realize how precious the freedom is that we have. And it is the ability, the freedom, frankly, the duty the opportunity to be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with our friends, with our families, in our churches, in our homes, and in the public square. And so that's really how you exercise it. That's how you preserve your freedom, is you exercise your freedom.
We had a unique system that said we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's no other system in the history of the world like that, where we said our rights come from God and not from government. But then they said to secure these rights, governments exist among men. So we have government to secure life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property help us pursue happiness. Creating is how we glorify God.
Welcome to Constitution Alive, right here in Independence Hall from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We are in the room where both the Constitution and the Declaration were adopted. This is exciting for me. I hope it's exciting for you. We're very honored to be able to be in this room. I'm actually standing in the very spot where American giants like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and others actually had the courage to light the torch of freedom. I don't think I can get across to you how excited I am about this. I kind of feel like, and I use sports analogies a lot, so forgive me for that, but I feel like that kid that has finally met their hero and they're about to get the autograph of their favorite ball player ever, because being in this room is as close as I'm ever going to get to actually shaking the hands of the Founding Fathers. So this is, if I'm a little bit giddy, you'll just have to forgive me tonight. I'm more excited than I thought I would be. I knew I'd be excited, but I'm just kind of in awe of what we're about to do. So I can't help but think as I'm coming in here tonight, and I know it wasn't a true story, and I know it's a bunch of fiction in there, but I was kind of thinking about National Treasure. Remember that movie? You know, Nicolas Cage is running into Independence Hall. He finds those secret spectacles of Benjamin Franklin, and they're able to see the secret and, you know, decode the message on the back of the Declaration of Independence. And I know we're not going to find any secret spectacles of Benjamin Franklin. We're not going to see any secret messages on the back of the Declaration. But I can promise you tonight, what we will find on the front side of the Declaration and the Constitution, in those words that were made available for the whole world to see, we're going to rediscover the secret sauce of American exceptionalism. We're going to find that formula, rediscover and reestablish that formula that made America so successful. So thank you for joining me tonight and being part of it. Those men that gathered in this room on those two occasions and put those documents in place, it wasn't enough just to write those words. The words of the Declaration would just be words on paper in some attic somewhere collecting dust if it hadn't been for the men that sat in this room and were willing to stand for the things that they were saying, willing to bring the words to life by literally putting their lives on the line. And as overwhelmed as I am to be in this room tonight and in the day that we live in, I can only imagine what it would have been like to be in here, in this room, whenever they signed the Declaration of Independence, when they were willing to put their lives behind the words that they were saying. I know we always read in history it was July 4th. Of course, the only guys to sign those few days between the 1st and the 4th was actually Secretary Thompson and John Hancock, the President of Congress. The rest of the guys came back in here on August 2nd. There was 3 or 4 other guys that didn't sign until later, but most all of them came in here on August 2nd. You can imagine that's a little bit different date. I mean, that's a little bit different occasion. It's one thing to vote and say, hey, Hancock, why don't you put your name on that document and send it over to King George. It's another thing to put your name on the line knowing that King George is coming after you put your name there. And they did that. They gathered here, and I love the letter that Benjamin Rush wrote to John Adams. These guys corresponded a lot after the Revolution, and Rush described in this letter what it was like to be in this room that day when they signed the Declaration of Independence. And Rush reminded Adams, he said, you know, when we came in, many believed that it would be our death warrant. He said no one said a word as they were called forward. He said it was totally silent. And Secretary Thompson from the front of the room started on his ride over here with New Hampshire, and he said, Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire. And Bartlett got up, he came forward, he took the pen, he dipped it in the ink, and he signed in total silence the Declaration of Independence. He went back and he sat down, and one by one they came. John Hart of New Jersey. And you can just imagine as they came forward and took the pen out of that silver ink well and dipped it in the ink, and you could hear that pen scratching along the surface of the Declaration. Well, no one said anything. One by one they came. And finally, Elbridge Gerry got up to come forward, and the silence was broken. Now, Elbridge Gerry was not a well-known founding father. We don't talk much about him today at all. He went on to be vice president later, but only thing you need to know about him for this particular story is that Elbridge Gerry was the smallest of the founders. I mean, he was a little guy. He was not the towering 7-foot Thor-like figure that stands before you here speaking tonight. He was
What are you laughing at? Okay, so, all right, I'm a little guy. Okay, I'm 5'8" with my boots on, all right? This guy was even smaller than me. And he gets called forward to sign the Declaration. And then this guy, Benjamin Harrison, Colonel Benjamin Harrison, from over here from Virginia, big guy. I mean, he was the largest of the founders. He hollers out at Jerry just as Jerry's about to sign. Now, this is the most important political moment in the history of the world. I mean, this is a serious occasion. And the big guy from the back of the room says to the little man up front, he says, "I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Jerry, when we're hung for what we're now doing. By the size and great weight of my body, well, I'll be dead in a minute or two. But by the lightness of yours, you're going to dance in the air for an hour or more before you're finally dead." Only words spoken during the, well, now after the signing, they do say, some say that Franklin said, who sat here, he said, you know, we better all hang together or else we'll surely hang separately. So, I mean, they knew what they were doing when they signed the document. And I'll tell you those two things because I think it's important for us to know that those guys that were in here, they knew what they were doing. They knew this was going to be a death warrant. They knew that by putting their name on the dotted line, they would have to give it all. And I love the fact that when they came up and took that pen and dipped it in the ink, when they signed, it was right beneath that final sentence. It says, "In support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Those were true patriots. They were sinners, they were fallen, they made terrible mistakes just like all of us. But they were patriots because they didn't just get excited, you know, sign the petition, go home, forget about it. These guys stood by their signature. Every single one of them. They did not back down. Not one of them failed to follow through on the commitment that they had made. In fact, when you think about the sacrifice that they made, all 56 of them giving of their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in one way or another, some of them literally giving their lives, many of them giving their entire fortunes, some of them lost their wives, lost their sons. They sacrificed a lot for us to be free, so that generations later, we could be free. I think sometimes we forget that our freedom's not free. We forget that there have been those that came before us that paid the ultimate price for us to be able to enjoy these blessings of liberty we talk so much about. And it didn't stop in this room. When these guys lit that torch of freedom, there were others that had to come alongside, that had to rally to the cause. In fact, I love what happened a few months later after Washington had begun to finally get his ragtag bunch together and began to be able to do some things, and he had freed Boston. And now, a few months after the signing of the Declaration in September of 1776, he's actually in New York City. And in New York, you've got a situation where the British have attacked at Staten Island. They defeated us at Long Island, and they've pushed Washington back to Manhattan. And now Washington's kind of dug in there. He's trying to figure out what to do next. He needs to know where the British are going to move next. He needs to know where their troop fortifications are, where their movements are, where they may attack next. He doesn't know any of this, and there's only one way he's going to get that kind of information. George Washington needs a spy. But in 1776, a spy was not what we think of today. I don't know about you. When I think of a spy today, I think of a secret agent. I think of one of these cool guys, you know, like Bond or Bourne or you know, I'm thinking of these guys that dress cool. They got all the gadgets. They act cool. They talk cool. I mean, they have gadgets that will allow them to accomplish any mission impossible. I mean, these guys can actually, with their gadgets, they can run down the side of a mile-high building without any problem. And even when they don't have the gadgets. I mean, you got to watch out because these guys can kill you with a paperclip, a toothpick, a magazine. It doesn't matter. They're going to take care of you. And they never lose their cool. Chaos all around them, and they can still ask for a martini. Shaken, not stirred. I don't know how they do it. But I'm in awe of these guys. That's not what it was like in 1776. All right, that's our movies. It sounds pretty. Go back to 1776, man. If you were a spy, you were the lowest of the low. You weren't a military hero. You were a hired gun. You were not somebody that either side trusted. And Washington knew that. He knew that if he sent one of those types of folks, they're going to be killed upon capture. He wasn't even sure he'd get the right information back. What Washington wanted was he wanted one of his trusted officers to step up and volunteer for this mission. But he wasn't about to demand it of him. He wasn't going to demand such a demeaning and dangerous mission. See, if you were killed on the battlefield, there was honor in that. If you were captured as a spy and hung, no honor in that. Your legacy was destroyed. Your reputation was ruined. So Washington's trying to figure out how to do this, talking to some of his officers. One of these guys gets an idea, and he goes back to his tent, and he's got a bunch of his officers there in his tent, and in hushed tones, Colonel Tom Knowlton is telling these guys why he needs somebody to step up and take care of what the general needs. Nobody's willing. In fact, Knowlton finally gives up. He turns to leave. He's going to head back to General Washington, telling him he's failed. And as he turns to leave, this kid standing at the door had come to the meeting late. He was actually ill with a fever, so he arrived at the meeting late. And as Knowlton's about to leave, this kid steps forward and he says, "I will undertake the mission. Now, to really understand what's happening in this tent, you got to understand this was not your ordinary group of officers. This was not your ordinary soldier at the door. In fact, these men were Colonel Tom Knowlton's Rangers. These were the original Special Forces. This was the first group of Army Rangers. They had recently been put together by Washington. These were the guys that were the Special Forces. Now, the only way for me to wrap my head around that, and you know, living in the day that I live in and trying to think about the Revolutionary era guys, Special Forces, I got to think like this, okay? Maybe you can join me in this. Just think Chuck Norris, but with a ponytail. Okay, that's the only way I can get my head around that. Okay, so you got these Special Forces guys, all these guys with their ponytails. They've gathered in the tent, and Knowlton's trying to find a volunteer. Well, the guy at the door is none other than Captain Nathan Hale. He's only 21 years old. 21 years old. Now, this is a guy that had graduated from Yale at 18. He had studied for the ministry, went to become a teacher for a few years, and he's teaching in New London, Connecticut. And while he's teaching there, the war breaks out. Lexington and Concord happens. Now, he's just halfway through his 19th year when Lexington and Concord breaks out, so he's still a teenager, basically. But when he hears about Lexington and Concord, he shows up at the town hall meeting there in his hometown to discuss what's happening. And this 19-year-old stands up in front of his community, and he says to them, he said, we should take up arms, we should march immediately, and not lay down those arms until we've achieved independence. Independence? I mean, nobody had uttered the word independent in his hometown yet, but this young man shakes his community from that colonial submission, shakes the hands of his students, and he marches off to war. And now here we are, a year and a half later. He finds himself outside this tent of Colonel Knowlton's, and a buddy of his is actually there. He's also an officer, a guy named William Hull. Captain William Hull had gone to school with him at Yale. And so Hull is trying to talk Captain Hale out of this. He's saying, you're never going to succeed at this. There's no way you'll accomplish the mission. He said, first of all, he said, Hale, you're too honest. There's no way you're going to be a good spy. You can't lie. You're going to fail in the mission. Secondly, this is an impossible mission. You're talking, there's no way you're going to achieve. And even, he said, even if you succeed, your reputation's going to be ruined. Your legacy is ruined. Don't do it. There's no honor in it, he said. Well, Captain Hale said, there is honor in any mission necessary for the cause of freedom. I will do my duty. Takes off, dresses once again as a teacher, gets across enemy lines and acts like he's a teacher looking for work. So he goes around New York there, and for about a week, he's mapping out the locations of the British troops. And he gets all of their fortifications, their movements, he gets it all down on paper, stuffs it in his shoe, then he's sneaking back across enemy lines, and he's captured. Well, evidence is right there on his person. There's no denying what he's there for. So literally that night, they sentence him to hang the next morning. And so that night, he's contemplating his fate. He's saying, look, I failed. I failed the mission. I failed the general. I failed the cause for which the cause I love so much. What can I possibly do? Well, he asked for a member of the clergy he's denied. He asked for a Bible he's denied. He finally gets a couple of pieces of paper, and he's able to write a couple of letters. And as he's writing these letters, he purposes within his heart to do the only thing left that he can do to help the cause. And so the next morning, they're marching him out, and the crowd has begun to gather to witness the hanging. And they give him a chance to say a few last words, and a lot of different people wrote different things about what he said. Apparently, he gave a pretty long speech. I mean, this 21-year-old actually gave an impassioned speech about freedom, about what the American cause of liberty was all about. And he's reaching back into kind of the days of college where he was actually a great orator, and he's reaching back into the rhetoric and some of the things that he had read then, including right here, Joseph Addison's Cato had been a big influence on Washington and the others, and Hale had read that in college. And so here he is, he's giving this speech, and these British soldiers are heckling him. They're mocking him. They're saying, you're wasting your life. They're saying, you're throwing your life away on a worthless cause. You cannot succeed. You're wasting your life. And then, of course, Nathan Hale said those words that we've heard over and over and over again. He said, I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. One life to give. He accomplished more in that moment than he ever could have with all that intelligence he was bringing back, because those words would be repeated over and over again among the American ranks. They would encourage those that were thinking about not re-upping to re-up and stay in. They encouraged others to get in and fight. And for generations, we've used those words to inspire generations to be willing to give of themselves for others, sometimes to pay the ultimate price in sacrifice. One life to give. We all have but one life to give, don't we? That's all we get. The question is, for what will we give our one life? We're blessed in America that Every generation, it seems, there's enough that are willing to be involved, to participate, to sacrifice, not just give their life on the battlefield, which is huge, of course, but also to live their life and live out the freedom that the others paid for. And as I think back to these guys in this room, to Nathan Hale and those throughout the Revolutionary period, fast forward to even now, guys like Michael Murphy, the Navy SEAL that received the Medal of Honor after giving his life. And so many of these guys. And really, when you look back over America's history, you think about all of those that sacrificed, the millions that served, 1.2 million that gave it all, that gave their one life for you, for me, for us to be able to enjoy this room tonight. You know, the good book says that there's no greater love that any man has than that he lay down his life for his friends, for, in this case, for his country. And those that serve in our military and in our first responders and on the front lines here in America as well, they are willing to give their one life for us. And I think about that book that James Bradley wrote about his dad, The Flags of Our Fathers, from Iwo Jima. My wife, her grandfather, got a Purple Heart at Iwo Jima, and it really struck me when he talked about that makeshift monument there at Iwo Jima. It said, when you go home, tell them for us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. We gave our one life so you could be free. I don't know about you, but I've always struggled with how to honor those that came before me. I've always struggled with how to obey the biblical command that says, render honor unto whom honor is due. But I think those that sacrifice and that give of themselves for us, they deserve our honor. But I've always wondered how. How do you, I mean, you know, when I meet a veteran, I always say thank you for your service, but it seems so empty. It seems like I'm not, I mean, how do I honor that they were willing to give their life for me? And I had kind of an epiphany moment, if you will, when I was sitting in a movie theater several years ago. You might have saw the movie. You remember the movie Saving Private Ryan? How many of y'all saw that movie, Saving Private Ryan? You remember the storyline, right? This kid has lost all his brothers. He's 19 years old. His brothers have all been killed in action. The Army figures this out. They want to get him out of the theater and get him home. This was the policy after the Sullivan brothers, the actual true story. And so they're trying to get him home to his family as the last surviving son, but they can't find him. And so Tom Hanks' character is a guy named Captain Miller, and his job is to get in there with his team, find Private Ryan, 19-year-old Ryan, and get him home to his family. And so throughout the movie, these guys on Captain Miller's team keep getting knocked off. They're giving their lives. They're sacrificing their lives for this one kid, Private Ryan. And so throughout the movie, you keep seeing all these guys sacrifice their lives. And then at the end of the movie, Captain Miller finds Private Ryan. They're just about to get him out, and Captain Miller gets shot. He dies. But just before he dies, he grabs this kid, this 19-year-old that they had all given their lives for. He pulls him in real close, and he said 2 words, not just to Private Ryan, I think to every one of us in this room, all of you at home watching. He said, earn this. Earn this. They had given their lives for him, and they're saying to him, earn the freedom that we've sacrificed for. And only as Hollywood can do it, they morphed from that young 19-year-old Private Ryan to 50 or 60 years later, an elderly Private Ryan has come back, and he's visiting the grave of Captain Miller. And I remember him kneeling down, and he said to Captain Miller, he said, tell me I've lived a good life. Tell me I've lived a life worthy of the sacrifice that you made for me. Earn this. I think it's time for us to earn the freedom. Some of you that have joined me tonight, you put your lives on the line. You sacrificed for my freedom. You were willing to give your life. Many that are at home watching, willing to do that. We want to earn the freedom that we've been given. How do we do that? I think Abraham Lincoln probably said it better than anybody. He said, it is from these honored dead that we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He's saying the way we honor those that came before us is we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. The cause that started right here in this room. The cause of liberty, the cause of freedom. We increase our devotion to that cause. That's how we honor what they did for us. And that's why we're here tonight. We're here to honor them and to say, look, they gave their one life for us. What can we do? What can we as citizens do? How do we give our lives, live our lives, if you will, in a way that honors the sacrifice that came before us? Well, we start right here by saying, what was it that these guys put together? What was this secret sauce, this formula that made our nation so free and so successful? And then what's our job? What can we do to help preserve it for future generations? I don't want you to leave this class saying, oh, that was kind of neat. You know, we got to come in and see where it all began, or, you know, we learned some stories about the founders we didn't know, and then go home and forget about it. I don't want anybody watching these DVDs and just saying, okay, that was kind of neat. We did that in our living room, our Sunday school class, or wherever we watched it, and then go home. No. My prayer is that you guys and ladies leave tonight, that those watching at home and those on the webinar tonight, that when this is over, you have a burden. I want you to have a sense of responsibility, that it is up to you to preserve this freedom for the next generation. In fact, I'm going to make a statement to you that you may think is a little bit overblown. My wife would probably say it's cheesy. She calls me the king of Velveeta sometimes. She just thinks I'm cheesy sometimes. But I think it's absolutely true. It's this. The fate of the free world depends on you. Fate of the free world depends on you. Now, you might say, all right, you're exaggerating, that's overblown. How many of you would agree the fate of the free world depends on America? Would you agree with me on that? How many of you understand that the fate of America depends upon her constitutional principles being upheld and preserved and protected? And how many would agree that the fate of her constitutional principles being upheld and preserved and protected depends upon the first three words of the Constitution, which is what? We the people. So if the fate of the free world depends on America, if America depends upon our constitutional principles, if our constitutional principles depend upon we the people, then friends, the fate of the free world depends on you. And so we're here to challenge ourselves, to dig deep into these documents to say, okay, what's my job? What do I go do as a citizen to preserve freedom? And I tell you, I'm seeing more of this than I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years, but I've never seen the level of activity in our nation. I've never seen so many people coming out to say, hey, I want to learn about the Founding Fathers. I want to know what freedom's all about. I want to know what the Constitution said. How many of you seen all these bumper stickers? How many driven by a car seen a bumper sticker that said, read the Constitution? Anybody seen one of those? Okay, a guy like me, I see that bumper sticker, I'm honking. Okay, I'm sorry. I get excited when I see that. But we've all said that for years. Read the Constitution. Everybody needs to read the Constitution. But we don't usually do it. Most people never actually pick it up. I didn't. I went through law school and was a legislator. I didn't read through the Constitution back then. In fact, I'll tell you what really got me fired up about actually studying the founding documents. I was sitting in my Capitol office back in Austin, Texas, back when I was a legislator. And I'm sitting in my office and I'm reading this poll, and the poll says, it was a Texas poll, so if you're not from Texas, you don't have to feel bad about this poll, but I'm betting your numbers in your state weren't any better. Here's what the poll said. The poll said that half of Texans, half, could not name one freedom out of the First Amendment. Not even one. There's 5 there that we love, we hold dear, we cherish, we'd fight for, we'd die for. Half of Texans couldn't even name one of them. 95% could not name 2 of the 5. I was appalled. Then I tried to name them. Then it was me. I couldn't name them. And I thought, wow, I'm a legislator. I'm a lawyer. I'm a political junkie, man. I live, breathe, and eat this stuff. I'm doing it all. And I couldn't name them. I thought, what a shame. If I don't know what my freedoms are, if I don't know where they are, how am I going to defend it? How am I going to teach my kids these things if I don't know myself? So that actually spurred a piece of legislation I did back then called the Celebrate Freedom Week. And what it did, we actually numbered it to House Bill 1776. I just love saying that in this room. I don't know why. I had to stand in line to be able to get that number for the bill. So House Bill 1776. And what it did was it said every kid in Texas has to spend time studying these guys. Studying the Declaration and the Constitution, studying the men that gave them, studying the ideas that went behind them, and studying our military, and studying the sacrifices made. And we're not going to just gloss over it once in 5th or 11th grade and forget about it. We're going to teach it every single year so that we can pound it into the minds of our young people, so we can put it in their hearts and their souls so that they'll appreciate the freedom they've been given, and they'll be able to defend and protect it for future generations. So we passed that bill, and now we've got several other states that have passed it. We've got an effort happening all across the nation. If you're at home tonight watching on the webinar, you're watching this DVD, go to my website at rickgreen.com and click on Celebrate Freedom Week and pull up the page there, and it'll tell you what's happening in your state. You can click on your state, and it'll tell you the action steps you can take to help make this happen in your home state. It's a great way to make sure every kid's studying these wonderful documents that came out of this room right here. Can you imagine how much better our country would be if every kid in America was studying the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? I mean, just imagine every single year. I hope you'll help us make it happen. Be sure and take that down as one of your action steps, hopefully, after this class is over. Let me just first say, folks, I'm no guru, okay? I am so blessed to get to work with some guys I think are gurus, guys like Ed Meese and David Barton and other guys like that, Matt Staver. I get to learn at their feet, and all I'm doing is I'm here with you as a fellow citizen. We're going to sharpen each other's countenance tonight. We're going to help each other open these documents and study them. So we'll have questions all night. Feel free to ask questions. We'll probably do them at the end of each section. You're going to stump me before the night's over, and it'll be fun, all right? Let's just have a good time together learning to be better citizens. And the other thing about the class, we're not an exhaustive study. This is not a year-long program. In fact, the best analogy I know to think of, how many of you ever bought a computer or a monitor or a big TV or something, and it came with a quick start guide? the nice glossy thing you could flip out, just because, something like this where, hey, I just want to know where to plug everything in, right? I just want to get this thing working. I don't want to read the big, thick manual that came with it. I'm never going to read it. I want the quick start guide so I can make this thing work. That's what we're doing tonight. We're going to do the quick start guide to the Constitution. Why? So that we as citizens can get plugged in, so we can make sure the pieces of our government are properly plugged in and working correctly, and so that we can make corrections on it if we need it. If you look at my books back here, these are all the things that I'm trying to study to be able to do the quick start guide. So these are the big manuals and everything, and I'm trying, and you guys can help me distill this thing down to where citizens all over the country. Now you guys You've traveled here from all over the nation, so you love this, right? I mean, you're willing to read the big, thick manuals, and many of you probably already have. But most people back home aren't going to do it, are they? I mean, how many times have you tried to get people to study the Constitution, and even if you just give them a pocket Constitution, they never open it? What we've got to do is we've got to put some tools in their hands that they can quickly access how this country works, and they can quickly access how to be a part of it. So remember our goal. It's to identify our rights and then know how to protect and preserve them, how to properly do that. So that's our approach number one. Approach number two is we're not going to focus on judicial interpretation. We're going to focus on original intent. There's another analogy for this one. My mom actually gave this one to me. She was a bank teller when she was younger. And she said, as a bank teller, I went through all this training and I handled all this money. And she said, Rick, they never gave me a counterfeit bill. They never showed me a counterfeit so I could feel it and know what it felt like. She said, no, what they did was they had me handle the real deal, the genuine article, so much so that when that counterfeit bill came through my fingers, I knew something's not right. Because I had worked with the genuine article so much, I recognized the counterfeit immediately. Same thing for us. We're going to study the real deal. We're going to study the Constitution itself. We're going to study the founders and what they said and did and how they acted when they were putting the Constitution in place. We're going to study the actual words of our founding documents, not on what some judge says that he thinks or she thinks that they meant. I think that's what's gotten us off course, is we've allowed judge after judge to pontificate on what some other judge said, about what some other judge said, about what some other, and we've gotten so far off course, and we got, you think about the freedom of religion now. We got so many tests on what the freedom of religion is, or when you violate that, or when the Establishment Clause is violated. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor had her 3-part test, then her 4-part test, and her 5-part. I mean, everybody's got all their tests, right? And it's just confusing. Why? Because we've gotten away from studying the original itself and what the founders did. So our goal is original intent. Let me give you a couple of quotes from the founders on this. They said, on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. And how about back to the room? I don't usually get to say that in the class. Let's carry ourselves back to the time. Here we are in the actual room where the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debate. So what these guys were actually saying right here when they adopted the Constitution. And instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it. In other words, instead of taking the words and, oh, well, today that word means X, Y, and Z, so this must be what the founders meant, or trying to invent some meaning into the Constitution to try to get an outcome on the judicial decision. Instead of doing that, Jefferson says we should go back to the time, study what these guys were actually saying, and he said then conform to the probable one in which it was passed. So these guys are going to speak to us tonight. They're going to tell us what they actually said about these different areas of the Constitution so that we can follow Jefferson's suggestion there. And then Madison, of course, the father of the Constitution, we'll hear a lot from him tonight. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. So in other words, you're going to figure out what it says. He says you go back to what these guys said when they adopted it, and then what happened in those individual states when they had their ratification debates. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. So you want the legitimate Constitution, you go back to the beginning what these guys did. If that be not the guide, so if you go the other direction, if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable constitution more than for a faithful exercise of its power. So what do you get? Instead of having a stable constitution and a clear understanding that stays true throughout time, and if you don't like it, you use Article 5 and you amend it. But instead of having that stable constitution, what do we get? 3-part test on this, a 4-part test on this. Total confusion about what is or is not constitutional. Madison said, come back to the original if you really want to know. He said, what a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in the modern sense. So when we think about phrases like general welfare, what did it mean back then? What did it mean in this room? Not what does it mean to us today, not what does it mean when a politician tells us what it means. What did it mean to these guys? We're going to talk about that too. The first in governing, this is James Wilson, by the way. Now this guy, he was in the room both times. He signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He actually went on to be a Supreme Court justice, one of the first guys George Washington nominated to serve on the Supreme Court. So he's actually an original Supreme Court justice. He said the first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it. Well, who made the Constitution? Guys that were in this room, right? The ones that ratified it back home. Those are the ones we got to, if you will, kind of crack open their heads, get inside their mind, figure out what they were thinking, what was the intent. And the last guy I'll give you on this is Joseph Story, Supreme Court justice that wrote about 94% of the opinions when he's on the court. He's actually called the father of American jurisprudence. He said, the first and fundamental rule in the interpretation of all documents is to construe them according to the sense of the terms of the intentions of the parties. These are the parties, folks. We're here, welcome to the party. We're here with the parties that actually gave us the documents, and we're going to hear from these guys and find out the original intent, not judicial interpretation. So, number one, it's not exhaustive. Number two, we're going to use original intent, not judicial interpretation. Third thing in terms of our approach is we're going to do something that we don't normally get to do with the Constitution. We're going to take it as amended. Those of you that have studied it a lot, you probably had some of those frustrating days like I did. When I first tried to study the Constitution, I opened up my pocket Constitution and I said, you know, first thing I was curious about, I said, I want to know about this electoral college. I want to know where this school is in the Northeast that all candidates go to. I was hoping for a little laughter there. No laughter. Can we dub in some laughter there, camera guys? Okay. A lot of people really think that. They think the Electoral College is some campus over, out here in the Northeast that all the candidates come to. No, it's the way we elect the president. So I said, I want to figure out how this thing works. I was always confused by it. So open up Article 2. Start reading about the presidency. 3 paragraphs in, guess what? This has been amended by the 12th Amendment. And what's your pocket Constitution do? It just underlines what's been changed, but it doesn't tell you what's been changed. So you got to flip over to the 12th Amendment and try to look at both of them and figure out, okay, what actually changed? What does it mean? And then 3 paragraphs into the 12th Amendment, this has been amended by the 20th Amendment. So I got Article 2 open, I got the 12th Amendment open, I got the 20th open, and I'm having trouble holding on to my pocket Constitution. And guess what? Article 2 is also amended by the 22nd and the 23rd and the 25th Amendments. So I got 5 amendments affecting Article 2, and I'm supposed to... I just went crazy. I am so thankful for my buddy Mike Haller. Mike put this thing together. He did meticulous work to put together this Constitution Made Easy, the tool we're going to use tonight. And I know you're going to, as the night goes on, you're going to think this green guy is really simple-minded, because I am. I need things to be explained. Okay, so Mike really helped me with this, and he laid out the Constitution as amended. What a novel concept. So the tool in your hands tonight, what you're going to be able to do is flip that thing open, and on the left-hand side of the page, we get the original, because I'm an originalist. I'm not for replacing that language. But we get the original on the left-hand side of the page, and then on the right-hand side of the page, we get the Constitution as amended. So the blue is all the amendments incorporated into the original, and it's in modern language. So that's the fourth thing we get is some plain language that makes it easy for people that haven't made a big study out of this to actually go and read through the Constitution very quickly. Well, part of what I love about that Constitution Made Easy is you can actually sit down and read the blue part, the plain language, in about 15 minutes. So people that have never been exposed before, you can hand that to them and say, hey, just sit down and read the Constitution. Just read through it real quick, and you'll find some things you never even knew were in there. You're going to be able to clarify some things you may not have been aware of before. So that's our approach. That's how we're going to do this. We got a lot to cover in a short period of time, and you'll find people say that David and I both, we talk about 90 words a minute with gust up to about 350. I'm gonna try not to gust on up to 350 too often in our echo chamber here. I'll do my best to keep the speed down, but we've got a lot of time together, and we're going to cover as much as we possibly can. So that's sort of our introduction to the process and what we're going to do, a little bit about our approach. We're going to talk about the seeds that were planted here, what the concepts were, because, you know, I find it interesting that if you just read the documents and you don't really go back to the philosophy that undergirds them, the philosophy that was put in place, you can get off track very quickly. So we'll be back to talk about the seeds of liberty when we return. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Well, I don't know if you could tell there, David, I was a little excited to be in that cradle of liberty.
Such a cool place to be.
Yeah. And you've recorded there several times. It's just something about being where it happened.
And it's, you know, I always love looking back at George Washington's chair, and that, you know, was it the rising sun or the setting sun on that chair? And I think, boy, you know, Franklin, that's such a cool story with that, but it's cool to be in that room.
I love it. So one of the things we talked about a lot, and we'll talk about a lot more throughout this course, is original intent.
Right.
Now, you wrote an entire book on this, a best-selling book on original intent, where you took all these documents in this room and really shared with us what was inside the minds of our founding fathers. Why is it so important to get that original intent?
Because that's where you get the most effectiveness. It's really hard to use a screwdriver as a shovel because it was not designed for that. So you can work all day long with a screwdriver and not dig something out. You have to know original intent, have to know how it's designed. It's like using the owner's manual. If you want the most out of your car, your TV, anything else,
you're not saying people would misuse the Constitution and for
not.
Something it wasn't intended to be used for.
You know how we talked at the beginning about human nature and principles, and that's why the Constitution works, because it's based on certain principles. One of those principles is human nature, and absolutely it can be. And we'll cover this in future lessons, but that's why we have checks and balances and separation of powers, and the Founding Fathers told us about human nature, and because of that, they put principles in there to keep people from taking and abusing this. It won't stop it if we don't apply those principles, but they gave us some tools by which we can stop some
abuse. I like that analogy, because now not just original intent, but original intended use. It's a good way to think of it.
It is. It is. And one of the things that's kind of a good example that you talked about, if we don't do that right then, you're talking about how we get off track, and you're exactly right. Here's a great example. This is one of the best-selling books in American history. It's one of the McGuffey Readers. They came out in 1830s and 40s and went through 120 million copies to this date. So, I mean, they have sold like crazy. So here is a 4th grade reader. And I just open up here to lesson number 9, Death at the Toilet. Wait a minute.
I have no idea. Yeah.
Why would they use such crude bathroom humor back in that day? Because back in that day, toilet is where we get the word toiletries, which is like your shaving stuff and your hair stuff. And well, toilet was really your vanity table, and that's why we call it vanity. So death at the toilet is death at the vanity table. And it deals with a young girl who was really cocky and pride and arrogant about how beautiful she was, and it turned into her demise.
Wow.
Well, we look at death at the toilet and say, I can't believe that you're such crude humor. No, you have to go back to understand what they were trying to do. Now, once we understand that, the principle's the same. The arrogance and the cockiness and the kind of stuff that they talk about with that girl, but it's not death at the toilet, it's death at the vanity table. Her vanity is what destroyed her. So that's the kind of stuff that still works, and it does have an impact. And that's why you want to go back and know original intent. We'll just go back where we started at the beginning with John Jay. These are the 6 things that we want every single citizen to be able to do. When you read and study the Constitution, number 1 is read the Constitution. Doesn't take 20 minutes, it's an easy thing to do. Number 2 is study the Constitution. Once you've read it, you kind of get the overview. Now go back and look at the things in it and start making the list.
And that's where we really are getting into the minds of the founders.
That's right.
We're studying what those words actually mean, not just reading them.
And as we go through these next lessons, these other lessons, we're going to be studying what that meant and why they put that there and why that clause is there and what are they trying to do. So
is that why all of these books are important? Not just the words of the Constitution, but when you pull a book off the shelf that is one of these guys in this picture that helped give us the document, it gives you a chance to really find out what they were thinking when they did it.
And it helps set the tone of the times. If you understand, you know, people accuse the Pilgrims all the time of being so bloodthirsty because they had the death penalty. So they did. They had 15 crimes that had the death penalty. But let's set the tone of the time. When they came to America from Great Britain, the country they left had the death penalty for over 230 crimes. So they've taken it from 230 death penalty crimes down to 15. I don't think they're bloodthirsty.
So that puts it in context.
Puts it in context.
If you just look at it by itself, you could get way off. But if you step back and see the big picture,
and that is the thing, you can get fixated on a particular issue, and you see so much of the trees, you miss the forest.
Yeah.
And that's why you read it to see the forest. Now let's go back and study some of the trees that are in the forest, and that's the second part. Third part is to be able to teach it. Once you see what's in there, teach it, especially the rising generation. But in this culture, with our poor education
system, all of us.
Teach all of us.
Yeah.
Teach. I love. There's a Bible verse in Song of Solomon 8:13 that says, "Your friends listen to your voice, so speak." Exactly. There, in this day and time, with what we have with social media, there's nobody who doesn't have a platform.
That's a good point.
There are people who will listen to you. There are people who will hear what you say on Facebook, do it on Twitter, whatever you got. Speak.
Might be 5 people, might be 5,000, but all of us have some folks we can influence.
You talk to your friends, and that makes a difference. Then what you want to be able to do is know those constitutional rights. Now that you've read and studied and you started teaching them, you now recognize when somebody has crossed the line. Wait a minute, he can't do that. That's not constitutional. And then at that point, you can defend those rights. If they're coming after you or if they're coming after somebody else, you can assert those rights.
Yeah.
So you stand up, and those are the 6 things that everybody needs to be able to do with the Constitution.
So you can't have that perception. You won't know that those rights have been violated if you haven't done these first steps first.
Right.
You got to study them and know.
See, I mean, you talked in there about how your mom, when they trained her as a bank teller, they didn't show her counterfeit stuff. They just let her handle the real stuff so much that she instantly recognized it. And we did the same thing in World War II. If you wanted to be able to recognize the enemy, you studied those enemy identification charts. So you studied all the enemy planes, all the enemy tanks. So when you saw it, you read, that's the enemy. Now we can defend and assert ourselves. We're going on offense.
Yeah.
You want to make sure you didn't get one of the Allied tanks. You know, you didn't want one of the British tanks. So you studied. And once you studied, you could recognize when there was something wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what it takes.
Well, as we study, you know, sometimes people today, I mean, if we're not doing a good job of this in our schools, then that means we need more tools. We've got to have the tools to be able to study.
And by the way, just so nobody gets intimidated over this thing, studying the Constitution and understanding it is not a hard deal. This notion that we get from law schools that only the 9 people in the Supreme Court really know what the Constitution is.
These high priests of the law.
I have been in several legislatures where I have, and it just tears me up. Legislators say, look, let's just go ahead and pass it, and the Supreme Court will tell us whether it's constitutional or not.
Yeah.
No. You took an oath to uphold it, and you don't have to be a brainchild to do this. And a great example of that is this little book right here. This is a book, an elementary book back in 1828, and elementary kids studied this I mean,
so they're teaching the Constitution to elementary kids.
You don't wait till you get to law school. You don't wait till it's postgraduate stuff. And the kind of stuff that they were having these elementary kids study, the questions they asked.
1828.
1828.
All right, so we're going all the way back. This is
pull
only
out some of the elementary questions.
Okay, so these are
now
questions.
You're an attorney.
These are
You were a legislator.
Now what if I can't answer it? This is going to be bad, which I'm probably not going to be able to. So these are elementary school kids, and they're asking them, can the Congress punish piracy? That is robbery committed at sea, because we have some of that today. So this is actually a good question for today. You know, you got the Somali Pirates, that whole movie about the Captain
That's
Phillips.
International law. So can we in America do anything to punish other nations under our Constitution?
Yeah. How many people? I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. So what does the Elementary Catechism say? Yes, and all other crimes committed there, it can also punish offenses against the laws of nations. So there's another question. And in fact, that's the next question. What do you mean by the law of nations? This is great. So this is done in a catechism way where you ask one question, it raises the next question.
That's right. And that's elementary kids. And I bet if you sit down in a law school and take third-year law students that are about to take their bar exam and run those questions through, they won't have, so
it talks about mark and reprisal, all of these things.
Nobody knows what that is anymore. And that actually is a very current thing that still goes on because it deals with restitution. It's a form of restitution. So there's a lot in there that's applicable. So do not get intimidated saying, you know, I'm not that smart. You don't have to be smart. Founding fathers, remember, these were average guys. They were farmers. They were shipbuilders. They were, you know, one of these guys he was a shoe shine guy. He made leather shoes and kept shoes. They're common folks, and they did this for the common, average, everyday person.
So if they could do it, we can do it today.
They can do.
And if kids of yesterday in 1820, little kids could do it. So it was intended as an elementary catechism, but we need it for all of us
absolutely,
today, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that's the whole idea of Constitution Alive. So when we come back, we're going to actually talk about the seeds of liberty. We're going to dive into some of these materials and talk about what was planted to give us such a successful formula here on Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. We're in the very room where the Constitution was framed. Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You should come here and visit. It's absolutely amazing. We do our course in here teaching the Constitution, and actually right behind us, Mark, that chair is the chair George Washington sat in throughout the convention.
Yeah, I think about that. You know, I kind of get the chills just being in the room to think that's the chair Washington, the indispensable man, the father of our country, sat in that chair. Something really interesting about that chair, there's a carving on the back of that chair. I happen to have...
Wait a minute, I've been coming here for years. This is your first time, and you get the props that they never let me have.
They call it Convention of States, right? This is a convention.
I guess, yeah.
I got the perks
I
here.
guess, yeah.
So it's important to remember where we were at in American history. The Articles of Confederation are falling apart. The nation's being torn apart commercially. States are kind of at each other's throats.
Financially broke. States aren't willing to pay. States are fighting.
So not unreasonable that Franklin's looking at this. He doesn't know whether it's a rising or setting sun, right? Looking at what's the future of the nation. Are we going to make it or is it going to fall apart? But in the end, he knows.
At the very end, he says, I've been looking, I've been wondering, is it a rising or setting? He said, it is indeed a rising, not a setting sun.
We have a Constitution that is the envy of the world. It was established for the rights and protection of all flesh, all people in the whole world. They knew they were doing something so unique that was the light of liberty in all the world. Let's do this. Let's come back and look at that recipe because it was structure, it was form, it was the system that they designed to check and balance, to provide a double security. In fact, Alexander Hamilton said this balance between the state and the national government is of the utmost importance because it provides a double security to the rights of the people.
I think the next generation, although there's obviously concerns about the generation, but I get a chance to work with some of the amazing young people of this generation that are much more conscious of their role, their God-given calling, and their duty, and much more talented and much more on fire for the Lord than our generation ever thought to be. And those individuals can go and should go into all these areas of life, in the judiciary, in the legislature, in every field of possibility, and really be light in these dark areas and transform the culture. I think this generation is going to surprise a lot of people because there's so much negative about them, but I see God raising up Gideon's army in this generation. I'm telling you, when you work with this generation, you realize our generation can't even hold a candlestick to what God is doing in this young generation.
Without question, the busiest part of our year is the week of Patriot Academy.
Welcome, Patriot Academy! The purpose of Patriot Academy is to awaken a generation.
We teach them how to make a difference in the world around them.
The goal is to learn the process that's used to make laws.
This is Cameron's first year.
I feel like I didn't have enough time.
You're gonna be nervous.
And if she doesn't lay out the bill, she'll start beating herself up.
They get to do everything that a real legislator would do.
Hey, are y'all for or against term limits?
He's flipping votes against a bill that I'm fighting for.
I was just counting up votes, and it does not look good.
Ronald Reagan once said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Those veterans literally passing that torch was incredibly powerful.
The banquet is a thing that I look forward to all year.
We want to make it a night that they won't forget.
Generations before us paid the price, whatever price necessary, to defend the fire of liberty. Now it's our turn.
All right. Well, we are going to get Ross Spano on the line. So as you can tell, we went an inch deep into the actual Constitution tonight. Yeah, and so there's much more to come. But understanding some of the structure, and you understand what he's talking about. And of course, we just saw just recently with the, I call them the Amy Coney Barrett trials, because they put her on trial, the same thing they did with Kavanaugh, that type of thing. So if you were following any of that, you began to understand the language of originality, okay? And then not trying to interpret Constitution according to modern day courts, but according to the language it was written in, understanding the original intent, right? Okay, so if you were following that, you understood the idea of original intent much more than if you just heard it talked about tonight, because we got to see it lived out. Oh boy, we have Ross Spano on the screen. All right. Can you hear us, Ross?
I sure can, and I'm sorry I'm so big there.
You look great on our screen here. So Adam, go ahead and switch. And then I think now we're on Doug, and you should be live. I can't quite tell on the screen up there, so go ahead and do your Zoom, and there we go. All right. So, Mr. Ross Spano, how would you like us to address you in the class today? You were a congressman, and now you're a citizen.
I would be absolutely. I would actually be most comfortable if you would just call me Ross.
Ross, okay, very good. Everybody say hi to Ross. Hi, Ross. First of all,
hey, everybody.
we thank you for your service to the country, and we appreciate that, and we thank you for joining us tonight and giving us some of your wisdom and experience. And so it's a little bit dangerous, but we're just going to open up the floor for some questions. Does anybody have any questions? Well, actually, before we do that, tell us a little bit about what seat you carried, how long you carried it, and if you have any noteworthy events that took place during your tenure.
Well, sure. Actually, I do have one specific thing I'd love to share with the folks there and may be interested in. But just by way of background, really quick, my name is Ross Spano. I'm born and raised in Central Florida and married, 4 kids. Been an attorney for about 22 years, but please don't hold that against me. I first was elected actually to the state legislature, Florida state legislature in 2012. I served 3 terms in the state legislature and then was elected to the U.S. Congress representing District 15, which included Eastern Hillsborough County and much of Polk County and also Lake County in 2018 and served there for 1 term. And what an incredible privilege it was. Just incredibly honored to do that and thankful to God that he allowed me to have that opportunity. One of the things I'll share with you, if I can, which I think a lot of people are interested in hearing about, is during the impeachment, kind of the sham impeachment proceedings that took place over the last couple of years. I had an opportunity to be involved in what we, as members of the minority party in the House of Representatives anyway, was the only thing that really felt we could do. We felt like we were kind of outsiders looking in, particularly as rank and file members of the House who didn't serve on the committee that was basically hearing or taking these sham impeachment proceedings. We weren't even allowed to be involved in the hearings. I wasn't even allowed to look at the testimony that was offered in those hearings. And so most of the members of the House felt like we were being shut out. And so we had an opportunity. There was a press conference that we did one morning as these proceedings were taking place, and we actually walked down to what's called the SCIF, which is a secret room in the heart and the bowels of the House where these secret hearings were taking place, and we demanded to be let in. And long story short is we walked in, and to which Adam Schiff was very, very surprised. We were there, and we refused to leave until we were permitted to be given access to those hearings to hear the testimony that was being offered. I remember that as members of the House, we were going to be asked to vote on the impeachment of a sitting president, which is the second most important thing that we're responsible to do behind the declaration of war. And we were not being given information on what was happening down there and the evidence that was being provided, the so-called evidence was being provided. So we went down there and we demanded to be privy to what was happening. Adam Schiff got up and stormed out, as did most of the other people that were there. There was just a few members of the House of Representatives. The refs were just attorneys, staff members, and we were there for just a few minutes, and Adam Schiff had Jim Jordan come back in and talk to us, and he said, hey, if you guys don't get out right now, I'm going to be filing ethics complaints against each one of you for doing this. And so we kind of looked at each other and said, well, go ahead. The American people need to know what's happening down here, what's taking place. And so he left and took that message back to Adam Schiff, and then came back a few minutes later and said, well, if I come in and we just have a conversation and call it a colloquy, and you air your side and I'll air my side, and then will you leave? And we said, well, is the press going to be permitted to come in, because the American people need to know what's happening down here? And he said no, and said, well, we said, pound sand, we're not going to do that. So we sat there for 5 hours that day and ordered pizza in, kind of an interesting situation. Then finally, toward that late that afternoon, leadership in the House actually scheduled, calendared a bill that was a very, very important bill that would fund rape kits. You know what rape kits are? Those are kits that take the DNA evidence from suspected rapists, and so those are important things that need to be funded. So they put that bill on the calendar so that we would be forced to leave that room because we had to take a vote on that bill. We left the room late that afternoon, went to the floor to vote on that bill, and then House leadership pulled that bill off of the calendar. So it was essentially just a means to get us out of the room. But I'm proud of what we did. We took a lot of heat for doing that. But if you all were just as frustrated by what was happening as I was, I hope you appreciated the courage that it took to do that. There were just a couple dozen of us who actually went down to the skiff and were willing to take the heat in support of the president based on what was happening. And so I can't even begin to imagine what the president has gone through these last 2 years. You probably sense that as well, but he has undergone the most incredible scrutiny and just unfair scenario that I can even begin to imagine. So needs our prayers, but in any event, that's something that was I thought you might be interested in hearing about. But again, it was certainly a privilege to serve, and I want to thank those of you who in that room who allowed me as constituents to serve you. It was truly an honor, and I feel blessed by God to have done that. And now I'm back home with my family, which is probably the biggest blessing that I could be experiencing right now. I'd love to talk to you about the Constitution. As an attorney, I hold it very dear, but as an American citizen, I hold it even more dear because it doesn't recognize, actually, it acknowledges, I should say, the rights, the natural rights that we are given by God. They're not rights that are given to us by men. They are rights that come to us naturally by God. And so the Constitution affirms those rights. But I wouldn't call myself an expert on the Constitution, but as an attorney, I know something about it, and certainly I can happy to offer my opinions as it relates to the Constitution and the political process. So throw the floor open for any questions.
All right, anybody?
What are you running for next?
What are you running for next?
Well, first of all, we have to have a conversation with my lovely wife about that. So right now I am practicing law again, and I'm just seeking the Lord about what the next steps are. Just to be very frank with you, serving in public office is, you don't tell many people this, but it is a sacrifice. You sacrifice time away, from your family. You sacrifice, your business and many other ways. So it has been a sacrifice. And so I will do it if God tells me to do it again. But right now I don't have any plans to do it. But if God tells me to do it, I'll do it. Right now, I just tell you, I'm enjoying my family. I'm enjoying just working and throwing myself completely into my law practice again. And I'm enjoying just being an ordinary citizen for the first time in, over 8.5 years.
Now, I have about 3 or 4 questions that I'll load them with, but I don't want to take the opportunity away from you guys. So I'm asking, looking around the room, if y'all have any questions, whether it be concerning even the state of Florida, because remember, he spent time in state legislature as well. So any questions at all? I'm going to give 10 seconds.
Go for it, John. I'd ask or pose the question. Howdy, sir. Adam Bell with Patriot Academy. I wanted to pose a question because Rick Green talked about this in his message, that as a legislator and as a lawyer, even he himself found that he couldn't have on command given the kind of 5 freedoms that are laid out in the First Amendment. What would you say in terms of the other congressmen that you're around? How many of them could go beyond the, yes, I support and uphold the Constitution, and actually understand more of what that means?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, if I had to throw out a percentage, I'd say it's probably less than 10%.
Yeah.
I mean, even the attorneys that probably serve there, couldn't really give you. other than just a superficial recounting of general constitutional protections. Couldn't really go into some detail about it. And so I overheard the last portion of the video that was on, and I heard David Barton encouraging you all to become aware and become knowledgeable of the Constitution, what it means. And I would venture to say that if you spent just a little time learning about the Constitution, you would actually know more than most members of Congress. So it is very, very important that people understand what their rights are, because let me tell you, those in power, including those in power here in the United States of America, if they find it expedient for political purposes or for purposes of their own making, they will compromise and abridge those rights that you have. And so you really, really do need to understand what those are so that you can assert them and protect them.
There was a question that came in online asking what your expertise in law is.
Yes, I am an estate planning attorney. So if anybody out there needs help getting a trust or a will or advance directives, that's what I do. I've been doing that for 20 years, and I love it because I get to work with families generationally. So I work with grandparents and their kids, and then their kids, and so I just love doing that. You might think most attorneys enjoy arguing, and I've done my part of that over the years. But more than anything, I enjoy working with families and small businesses, and kind of that's what I do, estate planning.
Any questions in the room? Oh, come on now. We have such a special guest like this. We got to have some good questions. Okay, here we go.
Hi, my name is Everett Evans. I've been very curious lately. How much legal power does Chief Judge Roberts hold over the ever Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, good question. Chief Justice Roberts, I mean, the name Chief Justice kind of makes you think that he has power, certainly influence over the other members, but I think that just is kind of it's a title. Each of the members of the Supreme Court, the 9 Supreme Court justices, have equal power, and so just the fact that he is the Chief Justice for now doesn't really give him any more authority in terms of influence, in terms of decision making. They each hold 1 vote. So what I will say, it's a little bit discouraging for me as a conservative, is the positions that Chief Justice Roberts has taken on many, many consequential decisions. Since he was on the bench, we were hopeful, just to name one in particular, the decision about Obamacare. He was the swing vote in whether or not the government could tax, whether or not that framework for Obamacare was constitutional based on the taxation and so forth. And so unfortunately, he was one of the swing votes, and many other decisions. So, but the good news is that with the President Trump's tenure in the White House, we now have a solid, in my opinion, conservative Supreme Court majority. And so notwithstanding what we all might fear reasonably as to what the Congress may now do with Democrats in control and control of the White House, we do have some solace in knowing that we do have a Supreme Court majority of conservatives on the court, which I believe and am certain will maintain at least our rights under the Constitution. So religious liberties and so forth, which they're important to me. I think they were probably important to you as well. So, but I hope that answers your question. He doesn't have really any more influence or power than any of the other justices.
All right, we had a couple questions pop up online. We're going to screen them before we go to them. And any questions in the room? Okay, towards the back. I'm going to run that way real quick.
Hello, my name is Cameron Woods. So the new administration, if they do decide to pack the Supreme Court, which we've heard rumors, what is that going to look like? What is that process? Is it a long process or something that could happen in months, years? What would be our first indication that that really could happen?
Yeah. Well, you mean you'd have to be something that's done, through Congress. There would have to be a change in the law. I don't think that will take place. Maybe I'm an optimist, but I don't believe that will take place. Especially now that they have control of the Senate. I think there was some concern that I think they perceive now that they have the ability to do what they want to do potentially through legislative means and mechanisms. I don't believe that they would. I think that's a bridge too far, I guess, is what I would say, even for Democrats at this point, to pack the court. I may be wrong, but that would be my opinion. And it would be a process that would be months and months. It certainly would take, at least I would think a year to do something like that. And there would be major political fallout, major backlash, major pushback. And so it's my opinion that will not take place.
That doesn't stop them from doing anything else.
Yeah, they may end up going too far. They like to overplay their hand. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Ross Spano, nice to see you, sir. You look good with the beard, by the way.
Thank you, man.
Last time we saw you, you didn't have that.
Yeah.
One main thread. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've gotten very relaxed, as you can tell.
I know you've even got that top button pop. So one main thread I keep hearing from course one to now is education. And, even Rick Green said himself, he quoted John Jay that, know the Constitution, read the Constitution, study the Constitution, teach the Constitution to future generations. That being said, Rick Green passed, I think it was HB 1776 out of Texas, meaning, National Freedom Day. We're going to teach the young the Constitution. What implications, what things are being done in Congress now to implement that from top down? I mean, is there anything in government that's saying, hey, this needs to be pounded?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And so, historically, states have been given authority to educate, correct? Right? I mean, we have the Department of Education, which wields some authority, and they have the ability to control what happens in education through funding and so forth. I'm not aware of anything on a federal level, but I know there are a number of things done on different states, conservative states particularly, that have required certain curricula in state schools that require teaching about the Constitution. Civics classes are required. Even when I was in the legislature, there were a few pieces of legislation that passed with respect to that. So there is movement that is taking place. But I think grassroots movements like the ones that you're involved in right now are very, very, very important, because they create an awareness, generally speaking, and then that awareness creates influences education, boards of education, state legislatures about the importance of teaching these things. So the good news is I think there's movement on that front in various state legislatures around the country. So I think we'll continue to see movement in that direction. I will say that, if I may, just for very, very quickly on this topic, it is so important for each of us to become aware of the Constitution, to get engaged. This event tonight is being held, at a church. I don't know what the religious affiliation is of many of you. I kind of suspect that most of you believe in God and believe He's in control of all things, including our nation and our leaders. So I would say the most important thing, even more important than in educating ourselves, is asking for God's divine intervention. I've said it for many years that we leaders are a reflection of who we are as a people. Generally speaking, not always, but it's important that as people, that we have a heart that seeks God, and have a heart that seeks goodness and righteousness and morality. And if we do that as a people, then generally speaking, our laws are going to be just. The interpretation of the Constitution will be just. Our leaders will be just for the most part. And so thank you for letting me take that liberty. But I would just encourage each of us to begin to pray that as a nation we would have hearts of morality and justice and righteousness. So the Constitution is so very, very important. Our understanding of it, our insistence that it be followed. But frankly, if we as a people decide to turn our back and turn our faces away from what the Constitution requires, then as we've seen in many instances, the Supreme Court can interpret the words of the Constitution to mean anything they want. Do you follow what I'm saying? And so we have to insist, as a people, and I think pray as a people that our justices, that our legislators will seek to follow through with what the original intent of that constitutional document was.
Any other questions? Up in the front. Go ahead, Bob. Hopefully he'll be able to hear you.
I heard you say that the Supreme Court justice didn't have no power over the rest of them. I think I remember here when they tried to petition the Supreme Court to intervene with the election situations going on, that there was a story that this John Roberts, I think is his name, was screaming and carrying on and saying, we'll have riots and we'll have this and that. And that 3 of the other jurists who were appointed by President Trump didn't even speak, didn't even address, didn't even fulfill their constitutional duty by being appointed by our president representing us. And yet this is still going on. How does that work?
Yeah, so I haven't heard that story. I don't doubt that it took place. But the fact that he got up and had a tirade about what he thought the Supreme Court should or shouldn't do doesn't mean he had any more authority than anybody. Those other Supreme Court justices had just as much right as he did to get up and tirade about what they thought should happen, about whether or not they thought that the Supreme Court had standing to take up one of these cases that was filed by the president. And so how does that work? It means the other Supreme Court justices that were appointed didn't stand up and say what they thought should happen. And they didn't vote. They believed that there should be standing in those cases. So I was optimistic. I don't know which particular case you're referring to, but I was optimistic that case out of Texas, I thought that was the best chance that the president had, in his challenges to what had taken place in the election. But the Supreme Court voted that there was no standing. And so that's a decision that they make, and some of those justices that voted that case didn't have standing were appointed by conservatives. And, that's the way our system works. We give them the authority to make the decision that they believe is right, that's constitutional. So I hope that answers your question. Just because he got up and gave a tirade he was using his influence, right, as the chief justice, but it didn't mean he had the power or more power to control what happened.
In some respect, the fact that he had to exercise a sense of physical and verbal dominance would indicate that he didn't have the actual authority. He's trying to take it, so to speak. Sure. I don't blame him. I'd have probably been yelling too. But anyway, all right. Front row is full of questions now. This is great. Paul Pickern from All Pro Pastors with a question here.
Hey, brother, how you doing?
Doing good, Paul. How are you?
Good.
I think you know each other.
I do.
Quick question, brother, and this will be simply your opinion, but with the potential change of power with a new administration, what do you feel is the greatest concern we should have as the church? What potential changes do you see coming? And if you see some, what would you say pastors and clergy should do?
Yeah. A couple of things I think of offhand as it relates to religious liberties. I think that you could potentially see some changes in the law as it relates to protections for speech by pastors and churches and whatnot. That'd be one of the things that I would be concerned about. And that's a big concern. When liberals have controlled the White House and the legislature in the past, we've begun to see some of those liberties abridged, compromised through the IRS and other agencies and so forth. So that would be one concern. I suspect that as religious conservatives, most of you are strongly pro-life. I think we'll see strong attacks on life. The Hyde Amendment is something that many of you may have heard of. That was an amendment that was passed to legislation many, many years ago that has been, for the most part, acknowledged and followed over the last couple of decades as it relates to funding for abortions, taxpayer funding for abortions and whatnot. And we will see taxpayer funded abortion very, very quickly. That'll be something that we'll see in numerous pieces of legislation that pass here over the next, I would say, even weeks. And so that's a major issue. Those would be the top two issues for me: is taxpayer funded abortion and compromises and abridgment to religious liberty from the pulpit.
Yeah, this is where I was saying the other day that it becomes increasingly important for us, to be very involved locally with city measures, county measures, and state measures, because not everything the federal government says and does actually gets rammed down all the way to the end. Certain things kind of get picked up and supported, so to speak. And besides that, there's usually just simply the threat, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's usually just simply the threat: if you don't go along with this, we're not going to fund this aspect or whatever. It's often money tied, and so it is possible for local governments, for state governments to say, no, we're not having that in our state. We're not going with that here. Well, we're not going to give you that $200 million for such and such. Fine, we'll come up with the money another way. So that is possible. Speak to that for a moment, if you would.
Yeah, that is true. In some cases, the federal government will tie funding to what they want you to do legislatively. So they'll say, hey, look, we understand states are potentially constitutionally, they have the authority to act in this area, right? But unless you do what we want you to do, we're not going to give you X amount of money. So you're absolutely right, 100% correct. There are areas where, as jurisdictions, states particularly, we have the ability to reject money, federal money, and so I'm hopeful that we would do that. In many cases, federal money through directly, however, that funds certain areas. There will be money provided for abortions to private entities and so forth. Not money that's not funneled through the states or through local jurisdictions. But you are correct. In many instances, yes, we can stand up and we can say, no, we're not going to take your money. We're not going to be bought out, and we're not going to do what you want us to do simply by hanging that carrot of that funding in front of us.
Okay. We'll do about a couple more questions if there are any. I'll ask him down in the front. Okay, yes, ma'am. He can hear you just fine. Just look at the camera. And...
I was just wondering, what about the executive orders that the President Trump signed? Are they null and void once he leaves?
They're not automatically null and void, but President Biden will quickly reverse those prior executive orders with his own executive orders.
That's what I figured.
So no, that's a good question, a valid question. So they don't automatically become null and void, but many of the great things that the president did, unfortunately had to do unilaterally by executive order, will quickly be overturned by President Biden.
Yeah, over the past, Obama was probably one of the first who really took it out of the ballpark to do executive orders in order to get things done. It really changed a precedence, if you will, of presidential executive orders. And then President Trump to some degree, made Obama's executive orders look like child play. I mean, he really came through with a lot of executive orders, but that's because he didn't have a legislative branch that would support him for a lot of stuff. So it was the only way he could get things done was executive order, executive order, executive order. The problem with that is the next president that comes along says, hey, you pushed through 2,800 executive orders, so I can do like 3,500, right? Or whatever the numbers were. Don't quote me on the numbers, you know. So that's kind of what we see happening is just an increase of executive order. One benefit to that is they can be undone in many cases, such as what you're talking about. Biden will come in and undo a lot of Trump's executive orders. So that means whoever comes in after Biden could undo a lot of Biden's executive orders. But the downside of what we're about to see in this coming president is you have they run the gamut. And so it's possible if they'll be, unfortunately, if they'll be a little more patient, they end up getting things done legislatively, which is the more accurate way to do it. But those things hold much more firmly. I would much rather see Biden do some executive orders that have the ability to be undone a few years later, as opposed to the things being pushed through legislatively that are very difficult to get untied. So, agreement there with your experience and knowledge?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. No question. No question. In one thing I might just add there is, in many respects, I think presidents have begun to legislate, so to speak, by executive order because the legislative branch has really ceded, in my opinion, its authority, its legislative authority to the executive. We have this thing called the, checks and balances, and the balance of powers of the three respective branches. And for a long time, the legislative branch and judicial branch and executive branch were kind of co-equal branches. And I think the legislative branch has taken a backseat, probably born as a result of maybe our own dysfunction more than anything. But because of that, because we're just so unable to really do much of anything of consequence, the president and executive branch have stepped forward and basically filled some of the vacuum that's been left by the legislative branch. So the legislative branch has some work to do in that regard.
Yeah, they used to have checks and balances, and now all they do is write checks. Yeah. Okay, the administrative state is really the entity that's setting policy more than anyone. Yes, that is happening over. That's Ashley Troutman, who is a local activist here in town, and who I really like. I don't know if you know who Ashley Troutman is, but I hope he runs for office sometime. We'll have to put a little pressure on him there, Ross. And
I'd love to see that. I would love to see that.
Yeah, well, we thank you for joining us today. I'll hold back my questions. It really has more to do with the impeachment and the process. I guess I will say this. We had 10 Republicans that more or less just turned their back on the situation and on President Trump. Our vote matters, and what happens is we have a tendency to forget 2 years later, 4 years later. So we have to remember these days. These are historical days. They literally, if history is written accurately, these days will literally be written down in the history books. So we're at a turning point. Just like in our lifetime, we looked at things of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and how things turned in our country. These are similar turning days. And so mark things down. Save newspaper clippings, even the ones that you think might be true. Save them. I posted something on Facebook the other day, and somebody said, "What are your sources for this or whatever?" So I gave them about a dozen sources, and I said, "By the way, these are all liberal media sources. You should trust these, since they were liberals themselves." But anyway, these are history. These are days in history right here that we're seeing. So. I'm glad you're in the fight. I'm glad you're a part and becoming more and more active. Mr. Spano, we thank you for your time of service for our nation. I know that you will be a very active citizen, even though you don't officially carry any seat any longer, but you still have influence. You still have voice. I imagine there'll be other people that are joining the Congress or state legislature and you'll have an opportunity to give them some advice and some wisdom, some counsel from your experience. And so we thank you for joining us today. Would you give Ross Spano a big thank you?
Thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor and a privilege. And I said earlier, it was an honor and privilege to serve you. Thank you for allowing me to do that. And I'd love to see a few of the folks right in there in that room run for office at some point. Get engaged. If God's laid it on your heart, if you feel compelled to be engaged and involved and to step out in a position of leadership, you should do it. We need more good people to step forward. Good to be with you. God bless you and your families. Thank you.
God bless you. For all of those that have joined us on Zoom tonight, we're glad you joined us. There's more of you on Zoom than there are here in the room, and there's a good crowd in the room. But until next week, we sign off. We say God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. Bye-bye.